Welcome to the debate. Our subject today is the fundamental economic and moral reality of immigrant labor within the massive U.S. construction industry.
And this is such a crucial conversation, I think, because the human element is just so incredibly pronounced in this sector.
Absolutely. I mean, we are dealing with high-stakes economics and equally high-stakes lives. The central question we have to grapple with is pretty stark. Does the industry's reliance on this specific, often vulnerable labor pool constitute systemic exploitation, or does it genuinely represent a necessary source of opportunity and income for the workers themselves?
Right. And we're not talking in the abstract here. The immediacy of this is it's undeniable right now. Federal enforcement actions have removed thousands of skilled workers from job sites. We're seeing projects stall, prices are climbing, and deadlines are just blowing up all across the country.
And that fallout, it tells a story. I'm going to argue that the crisis we're seeing right now, it confirms this system is fundamentally one of exploitation driven by a deliberately leveraged vulnerability.
And I'm going to come at it from a different angle. I'll argue that while the system is, without a doubt, imperfect and needs oversight, it has historically provided real opportunity. It's enabled upward mobility and income for people who willingly took the work, often because it was the best option they had.
So my core argument, and I think this is really where it all starts, it's rooted in the structure of power. The construction industry is systematically benefited from a labor force with substantially less bargaining power than, well, pretty much any other sector. General contractors and subcontractors, they didn't just stumble upon this. They knowingly exploited that imbalance for profit. This isn't just about supply and demand. It's about manufactured conditions. Lower pay was never driven by a lack of skill. I mean, the current labor vacuum proves the skill is absolutely essential. The low wages were driven by replaceability and the structural limitations on a worker's ability to demand better.
How do those limitations really manifest on the ground, though?
They manifest as risk and exclusion. We saw workers routinely paid in cash, which, excluded them from benefits, from traditional tax filing, and often, critically, denied them necessary safety protections or workers' compensation if they got injured. When a worker cannot report wage theft, cannot push back against dangerous conditions, or fears immediate deportation or losing their job if they ask for documentation, that is not a negotiation. That is coercion. The industry normalizes these low wages by saying, oh, that's the market rate. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. If wages only stay low because workers have absolutely no ability to organize or enforce their rights, that is not a free market. That is a system designed for maximum employer advantage, which is, it's the definition of exploitation.
That's a powerful position, and you're focusing on the structural harms. But we have to look closely at the other side of that exchange, the perspective of the worker who is making that choice. Now, I am not defending unsafe conditions or a lack of benefits, but construction provided real income, real skills, and tangible opportunities. For many, they were earning significantly more than any alternatives available to them, whether in their home countries or in other sectors here.
But that choice is made under duress, wouldn't you agree? Is it really a free choice?
Well, I agree the leverage is uneven, but let's just talk about the results for a second. Many workers chose construction because it paid better. It allowed them to send critical remittances home, which is a life-changing amount of money for their families. They built independent crews, they learned complex trades, electrical, plumbing, masonry, trades that honestly much of the domestic population has for decades now refused to pursue. We need nuance here. Not every GC or subcontractor was engaged in pure exploitation. Plenty of contractors paid reasonably well, they treated their crews like family, and they actively helped those workers advance. Opportunity doesn't have to be, universally ethical or structurally perfect to be real and massively beneficial for an individual worker and their family. Look, I see why you're centering the argument on power dynamics. I do. But the current crisis presents a massive contradiction to the cheap, replaceable labor premise. If this was simply exploitation, if these workers were just low-skilled, interchangeable hands, why does the entire multi-trillion-dollar industry seize up and basically collapse when this labor is removed?
Because the system was dependent on a very specific form of highly skilled, yet easily suppressible labor.
But the current scramble by GCs who are now frantically trying to lure workers back with massive bonuses and wage hikes, that reveals their deep reliance on highly skilled workers.
Many of these people have been running specialized equipment or managing sites for decades. The industry's paralysis right now, it actually undermines the idea that they were simply replaceable cogs. They are not collapsing because of a lack of bodies. They are collapsing because of a lack of institutional knowledge and technical expertise.
That's an interesting point, but I would frame it very differently. The collapse is not evidence that the previous wages were fair. It's evidence of staggering systemic dependency and, frankly, gross hypocrisy. The industry didn't collapse because workers were deported. It collapsed because it was addicted to a system of suppressed costs that it pretended didn't exist. Let's look at the hypocrisy question you just raised. If immigrant labor was stealing jobs, as the narrative went for years, why can't those jobs be filled now by domestic labor?
Because construction is hard, it's dirty, and it's often dangerous work. The domestic labor pool isn't structured to just jump into those specialized roles overnight, especially not in the volume required.
But if the wages were genuinely fair and fully reflected the skill required, let's say $35 an hour for a skilled framer, why do prices skyrocket and projects just disappear when this labor vanishes? The fact that GCs are now willing to pay 30 or 40% more now to retain or replace that skilled labor proves one thing definitively. The historical wages were artificially suppressed by leverage, not determined by the true, actual market value of the work. The industry was running on a cheat code.
The price increase is certainly a function of scarcity, yes, created by sudden enforcement. But you're creating a false dichotomy. You assume that because the scarcity-driven rate is high, the previous rate must have been inherently exploitative. That ignores the reality that before this enforcement spike, these jobs were taken willingly because they were the best available option for skill development and income. They were meeting a critical market demand.
Let's focus on GC accountability for a minute, because that is where the power resides. We have to demand answers to the hard questions GCs have successfully avoided for years. Questions about their risk modeling and their labor costs. I mean, would they pay the same low rate if these workers had equal leverage, if they were fully unionized, had full documentation, and had robust legal safety nets? I think we all know the answer is no.
You are entirely correct about safety. When we look at issues like trench collapses or falls, which are tragically common in construction, we know that undocumented crews are less likely to report OSHA noncompliance because they fear retaliation. That is a moral failure of the system that has to be addressed, regardless of a worker's status.
Exactly. And would GCs tolerate the same dangerous, unprotected conditions if legally required inspections were consistently present and fully enforceable? The silence from the industry on this point, it speaks volumes. I'm sorry, but the market rate was not natural. It was manufactured by ensuring the worker had no ability to negotiate, no driver's license to travel to a higher-paying job, and absolutely nowhere to go when wage theft occurred. That loss of leverage kept labor costs stable and low for decades.
While that unequal leverage is real and the moral case for safety is absolute, the solution cannot be the complete removal of the opportunity, which is what's happening now. Taking away the available income stream harms the very individuals who relied on construction to survive or send remittances. You are prioritizing the moral cleanup of the system over the practical economic reality for the individual trying to feed their family. You're asking them to starve ethically.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective on the economics of this. Low wages, driven by leverage, didn't just hurt the worker, they fundamentally hid inefficiency for the GCs. And this is a critical structural point. By having cheap, replaceable labor, GCs didn't need to innovate. They avoided process optimization, they avoided investing in expensive automation or better technology, and they certainly didn't need to spend time on sophisticated project management or extensive training.
You mean the low labor cost was a crutch?
Precisely. It was a crutch that allowed them to externalize their true operational costs onto a vulnerable workforce. If crews were fully documented, properly insured, and protected, meaning they were no longer replaceable and could demand real market wages, that forces GCs to confront the true, sustainable cost of construction. They would be forced to innovate, adopt technology, and become more efficient, something they avoided as long as labor remained cheap and silent.
That insight about hidden inefficiency is potent, and I'll concede that the system worked disproportionately in favor of the employer.
Structural factors undeniably enabled GCs to suppress costs and avoid necessary investment. But let's return to the ground level, to the workers' upward mobility, because this is where the benefit is tangible. For many, that consistent cash income, while fraught with risk, it allowed for a foundational economic step-up that was often unavailable elsewhere. We are talking about financing a home back home, paying for a child's education, or escaping grinding rural poverty. Those are tangible social and economic improvements fueled by construction work.
And that is the ultimate bitter contradiction of this entire system, isn't it? I mean, contrast the complete invisibility of these workers, for years ignored in safety reports, excluded from benefits, generally unseen by the wider public as anything other than a disposable utility, with the industry's current near-hysterical inability to function now that they are gone. That massive, gaping paradox reveals the core dependency. The system worked perfectly, but only by suppressing labor costs through fear and replaceability.
The visibility of their absence is certainly telling of their essential nature and their skill.
But think about the dynamics. When workers had less leverage, wages stayed low, dangerous conditions were ignored, and the industry was quiet. They had no complaints because their cheap, skilled labor was flowing freely. Now that the leverage has dramatically shifted due to enforcement, now that the cheap supply is gone, costs rise instantly. Projects stop, and suddenly the industry's complaints get loud and public. They are only complaining now because their costs are rising, not because the injustice has suddenly become apparent. And that distinction, that tells you everything you need to know about who benefited most from the status quo.
But we do have to acknowledge that the historical presence of this labor allowed vast amounts of infrastructure and development to occur. It created secondary jobs all across the supply chain, and it provided crucial income where it was most needed, bridging massive economic gaps for vulnerable families. It's a complex legacy of simultaneous benefit and structural injustice.
The benefit was real for the individual, yes, but the structure was fundamentally corrosive.
And we have to ensure that any efforts to address the exploitation don't accidentally pull the rug out from under the very workers we aim to protect.
Ultimately, this crisis just confirms the historical injustice. The industry was operating on suppressed labor costs, driven not by true market equilibrium, but by fear and replaceability. The massive, immediate jump in labor costs and project delays proves that the historical wages were artificially low, a direct result of unequal leverage, not a fair valuation of skilled labor.
While the power dynamics were undoubtedly skewed and systemic exploitation certainly existed, we cannot discount that construction offered a genuine lifeline, tangible skills, and real economic solvency for millions of workers who accepted the terms. The debate must always balance those necessary moral imperatives against the practical realities of economic opportunity for marginalized groups who saw these jobs as their best pathway forward.
Examining these two opposing perspectives, it really just illuminates a deep-seated structural dependency in our economy, one that was built on calculated vulnerability.
And it forces us to ask some very uncomfortable questions about our priorities and what we are truly willing to pay for the society we all live in.
Which leaves the final question. If transparency, fair pay, and fully documented labor had always been the ethical standard in construction, if those externalized costs had always been internalized, would this even be a debate today?